They didn't cry when they loaded her into the wagon. Her father counted the silver twice, his fingers greasy with mutton fat, while her brother refused to look her in the eye. They called it a treaty. Maeve knew better. She was just a piece of meat traded to keep the wolves from tearing down their fences. They expected King Osmond to break her by morning. What they didn't understand was that a monster's house is sometimes the only place a girl can finally learn to breathe. The coins made a dry, clicking sound against the grease-stained oak of the kitchen table. Garrick counted them with his thumb, pushing each heavy disc into a neat pile of 5. He didn't use a purse. He had a wool rag, filthy at the corners, which he folded over the silver with the slow, deliberate care of a man who had never held more than 3 shillings at once in his entire miserable life. Maeve sat by the hearth. The fire was dying mostly grey ash and the bitter smoke of damp birch that made her eyes sting. She didn't look at the money. She looked at her brother Alden, who was pretending to grease a pair of work boots by the door. His hands were shaking enough that the pig fat kept smearing across his knuckles instead of the leather. "You'll have a horse," Garrick said. His voice was thick with the phlegm of a winter cold he'd been nursing since November. "A proper one. Not the old mare with the bad hock. One of the king's beasts." Maeve pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wool was coarse, full of dried burrs that pricked her skin every time she moved. "The king's beasts eat men, father." Garrick didn't look up from his knot. "They eat what they're given. You mind your tongue, girl. This is 3 years of grain. This is 4 head of cattle we don't have to buy from the bailiff come spring. You think you're worth more than that, a 3rd girl with a slow leg and a sour face?" She didn't argue about the leg. It wasn't deformed, just stiff from an old winter when she'd fallen through the ice on the creek, and stayed there until her mother dragged her out by her hair. Her mother was 5 years in the churchyard now, under a stone that was already sinking into the moss. Maeve sometimes envied her the quiet. "Alden," Maeve said softly. Her brother stopped his rubbing. He still wouldn't look at her. His gaze fixed on the dirt floor between his feet. He was 20, big-shouldered but soft in the mouth, the kind of boy who would hide behind the pigsty when the tithe collectors came. "The king's men are at the crossroads." Alden muttered, his voice cracking like a dry twig. "They don't like to wait. The horses were sweating in the fog." "Then get a bag." Garrick snapped. There was no bag. There was only an extra shift made of unbleached linen and a small horn comb that had belonged to her mother, its teeth mostly broken from years of thick hair. Maeve tucked them into the front of her cloak. She didn't have shoes for the mud, only her indoor slippers of cured hide, thin enough that she could feel every cold pebble through the soles. When she stood, her knee gave its familiar dull click. Neither man moved to help her. The door opened into a grey wall of mist. The Valley of Gulsend was always like this in the late months, cold, that crawled up from the river and stayed in your clothes until you felt like a corpse yourself. At the end of the lane, 2 horses stood like statues in the damp. They were massive things, broad-chested and dark, their breath coming out in long, white plumes that mixed with the fog. The man holding the reins didn't look like a soldier. He wore no iron plate, only heavy layers of boiled leather and a wolfskin cloak that smelled powerfully of wet dog and old tallow. His face was broad-scarred across the bridge of a broken nose, his eyes small and yellow-brown like a hawk's. "The girl?" the man asked. His voice sounded like stones rolling down a dry creek bed. "Maeve," Garrick said, pushing her from behind. His hand was heavy on her shoulder blades, a brief, hard shove that took the place of a farewell. "She's clean. She knows how to bake the hard bread, and she don't talk back when she's hit." The rider looked down at her. He didn't smile, nor did his expression soften. He simply reached out a hand that was twice the size of hers, his fingers thick as sausages, and gripped her by the forearm. With a single effortless tug, he hauled her up onto the pillion behind his saddle. The leather was cold. The horse moved instantly, turning back toward the high ridges without a word from its rider. Maeve didn't look back at the cottage. She knew exactly what it looked like, the thatch rotting on the northern eave, the woodpile low, her father already reaching for the jug of turnip beer he hid behind the flour barrel. They would have the ox by Tuesday. They would forget the sound of her gate by harvest. The climb into the hills took hours. The air grew thinner, sharper, smelling less of river rot and more of pine resin and ice. The rider didn't speak to her. Once, when the horse stumbled on a loose shale bank, his grip on the reins tightened so hard the leather groaned, but his body remained perfectly still, a heavy, solid mass that blocked the wind from her face. "Where are we going?" she asked after the sun had gone behind the peaks, leaving the sky the color of an old bruise. "The keep," the man said. "Is he as big as they say?" The man gave a short, sharp grunt that might have been a laugh. "He's bigger." They reached the gates when the dark was absolute. Winterbourne wasn't a castle like the ones in the south. There were no white towers or silk banners flapping from the ramparts. It was a blockhouses of dark granite, built directly into the side of the mountain, so that the rock of the cliff face formed its rear walls. The stones were huge, square-cut and black, with wet moss, looking less like a home for men and more like a natural shelf of the earth that had grown teeth. Iron torches burned in brackets by the iron-studded oak doors. The light was orange-smoky, casting long, jerky shadows across the cobblestones as the horse walked into the courtyard. There were other men there. They all looked like the rider, thick-necked quiet, moving with a strange, heavy grace that didn't belong to human bones. They didn't shout or catcall as she was brought in. They just watched her with those flat, yellow-brown eyes, their nostrils flaring slightly as the wind shifted, catching her scent. The rider dismounted and held his hand out again. Maeve slid down her stiff leg, striking the stone with a shock of pain that went straight up her spine. She stumbled, her thin shoes slipping on the wet ice of the yard. A hand caught her by the scruff of her cloak, steadying her before she could hit the ground. It was the rider. He didn't say anything, just pointed towards the great arched doorway, where a yellow light spilled out onto the dark stone. "Go on," he said. "He's waiting for his supper." The great hall smelled of old grease-dog hair and the sharp, sour tang of spilled ale. It was long and low-ceilinged, the rafters black with decades of soot from the twin hearths that burned at either end. There were no tapestries on the walls, only the grey granite blocks and rows of iron hooks where hunting spears and heavy iron axes hung like kitchen utensils. At the far end, behind a trestle table that had been hacked and scarred by knives, sat the king. Osmond didn't look like a king from the stories. He wore no crown, only a simple band of hammered iron that held his dark, shaggy hair out of his eyes. He was larger even than the rider who had brought her, with shoulders that seemed to fill the space between the twin torches behind his seat. His tunic was made of grey wool, torn at the sleeve, and mended with coarse black thread that looked like it had been put in by a blind man. He was eating a piece of salt beef with his fingers, his jaw moving with a slow, rhythmic crunching sound. A great hound, its coat the colour of winter mud, sat by his knee, its eyes fixed on his hand. Maeve stood by the door. The stone beneath her feet was cold enough to numb her soles through her thin hide shoes, but she didn't move. She kept her hands tucked into her cloak, her fingers wrapped around the broken horn comb. Osmond didn't look up until he had finished the beef. He wiped his greasy fingers on his thigh, then reached for a pewter mug, swallowing 2 great gulps of whatever was inside before his eyes found her. They weren't yellow like the others. They were a dark, heavy grey, the colour of the sky before a blizzard. "You're small," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a vibration to it, a low rumble that she could feel in her teeth. "The small ones eat less," Maeve said. Her voice sounded thin in the vastness of the hall, but it didn't shake. She had spent 19 years being the smallest thing in a house full of angry men. She knew how to keep her breath steady. The king leaned forward, his elbows resting on the scarred wood of the table. His forearms were thick as pine logs covered in dark hair and crisscrossed with thin white lines, scars from teeth, from blades, from briars. "Your father told my bailiff you were 20. He lied." 19, she said. "He wanted the extra silver before the frost set in." "He sold you for 20 pieces. Osmond said, his grey eyes narrowing slightly. "A good mule costs 30. "The mule can pull a plough," Maeve replied. "My leg is bad. I'm less useful than a mule." A few of the men who had entered behind her laughed, a dry barking sound that died instantly when Osmond raised his hand. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the popping of the damp logs in the hearth. The king stood up. He was taller than she had realized, his head coming within a foot of the low rafters. When he walked around the table, his movements were silent. For a man of his size, he didn't make the floorboards groan. He moved like a shadow across the grease-stained stone. He stopped 3 paces from her. The smell of him hit her, then not the rot of the village or the sourness of the ale, but something old and wild. It smelled of wet earth, of pine needles crushed underfoot, and the sharp coppery tang of iron. He reached out and took her chin between his thumb and forefinger. His skin was hot, unnaturally hot, like a stone that had been sitting by the fire all night. His grip wasn't hard enough to bruise, but it was absolute. If she tried to pull away, she knew her jaw would break before his fingers moved an inch. He tilted her face toward the torchlight. He examined her eyes, her nose, the small scar on her lip, where she'd taken a bucket to the mouth when she was 12. "They think I'm going to eat you," he said softly. "They don't care if you do," she said. "The silver is already in the wool rag." Osmond looked down at her feet. He saw the thin hide shoes already soaked through with grey slush from the courtyard, and the blue tinge of her ankles. His brow furrowed, a deep line appearing between his shaggy eyebrows. "Bram," he called out without looking back. The rider who had brought her stepped forward. "Sire." "The girl's room. Is there a fire?" "The chimney's clear, but we haven't laid the wood." "Lay it," the king commanded, "and fetch Mrs. Garrow. Tell her to bring some of the tallow salve for the feet. If the girl loses a toe to the frost, I'll take 2 of yours to make up the weight." Bram didn't argue. He bowed his heavy head and disappeared into the shadows of the screen passage. Osmond let go of her chin. The spot where his fingers had been felt cold now, the wind from the door hitting the dampness of her skin. He turned his back on her, walking back to his bench with that same silent, predatory stride. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a low stool by the smaller hearth. "The beef is salt, but it's hot. Eat until the old woman comes." Maeve didn't move towards the stool immediately. She looked at the long table, at the remnants of the meat, and then at the king, who had already taken up his knife again. "Why did you buy me?" she asked. Osmond didn't look up. He drove the point of his knife into the tabletop, leaving it quivering in the oak. "Because your father would have given you to the miller for 10, and the miller has 3 wives in the churchyard already. At least here the walls are thick enough to keep out the wind." The chamber they gave her was at the top of the western blockhouse. It was small, square, and smelled intensely of lime wash and old sheepskins. A fire had been built in the small hearth, but the room was so cold that her breath still came out in white puffs that drifted toward the narrow arrow slit in the outer wall. Through the slit she could see nothing but the black expanse of the pine forest below the trees, moving like a dark sea under the moon. Mrs. Garrow was a woman made of knots. Her fingers were crooked from the boneache, her hair a yellow-grey nest tied up with a piece of dried gut. She didn't speak while she smeared the tallow salve onto Maeve's feet. Her hands were rough, her skin like salt-cured fish, but she didn't pinch or push. "The king doesn't like a noise," the old woman said, as she wrapped Maeve's feet in strips of grey flannel. "If you're a screamer, you'd best learn to bite your tongue. He has the ears of a hare." "I don't scream," Maeve said, watching the grease sink into her red skin. "My mother taught me that before she died. Screaming just makes them hit harder. Mrs. Garrow gave a short, dry snort. She set the jar of salve on the stone floor with a click. "There's no hitting here. Not from him. He doesn't need to use his hands to break a thing." "Then how does he do it?" The old woman stood up, her joints cracking like dry kindling. "He just waits. He waits until you see what he is, and then he lets you choose whether to jump off the wall or stay." She left without taking the candle. Maeve stayed by the hearth until the grease had dried on her skin. The flannel wrappers were warm, warmer than anything her father had ever given her. She lay down on the low pallet bed, which was stuffed with dried bracken that smelled of summer earth. She expected to lie awake listening for the sounds her village always warned her about, the howling of the pack, the scratching of claws against the oak doors, the sound of men turning into beasts in the dark. But there was only the wind. It whistled through the arrow slit, a long, low moan that sounded like someone blowing across the top of an empty jug. She fell asleep with her hand still wrapped around her mother's comb. The next morning brought no sun, only a hard white light that made the stone walls look even greyer. Maeve found her way down to the kitchen by the smell of baking bread. It wasn't the fine white loaf of the towns, but the heavy grey rye bread that had to be soaked in broth before an old man could chew it. The cook was a man named Thomas, whose left arm ended at the elbow in a puckered red scar. He didn't look at her when she came in. He just kicked a three-legged stool toward the hearth and pointed at a basket of parsnips. "Scrape 'em," he said, the small knives by the salt tub. She sat and began to work. Her leg was stiff from the night cold, but the hearth was hot enough to ease the dull throb in her joint. She scraped the grey skin from the roots, her movements steady and rhythmic. By midday, the kitchen door opened and Osmond came in. He was covered in mud from the waist down, his boots caked in grey clay that dried and fell off in flakes as he walked. He had a dead roebuck slung over his shoulders, its neck broken and dangling, its dark blood dripping onto the stones with a slow, heavy thud, thud, thud. He dropped the beast on the large centre table. The wood groaned under the weight. "The wolves are down from the high ridge," Osmond said to Thomas. He didn't look at Maeve, though he passed within 2 inches of her stool. "They're taking the mountain sheep. Tell the boys to double the watch on the lower fold." "They're hungry this year," Thomas said, not looking up from his flour trough. "The frost came too quick. They can stay hungry," the king said. He reached for a ladle of water from the copper boiler, draining it in one long, noisy swallow. His throat was thick, the skin there lighter than the rest of his face, marked by 3 deep white furrows that looked like they had been made by iron talons. He set the ladle down and finally looked at Maeve. She was still holding a half-scraped parsnip, the iron knife steady in her right hand. "Your leg," he said. "How is it?" "It works," she said. "Can you walk the ridge if I have a stick?" Osmond grunted. He reached into his belt and pulled out a small, curved knife with a handle made of smoothed staghorn. He laid it on the edge of her parsnip basket. "Don't use the kitchen blade if you go out," he said. "The steel's soft. It'll bend if you hit a bone." Maeve looked at the knife. The blade was short but thick, the edge bright and sharp enough to see her own grey eyes reflected in the metal. "I don't know how to skin a deer, my lord." "Then learn," Osmond said. "I don't keep anyone here who only knows how to sit by the fire." He left the kitchen as quickly as he had come, leaving the smell of wet fur and fresh blood behind him. Maeve picked up the horn-handled knife. It was heavy for its size, perfectly balanced the horn cold against her palm until her skin warmed it. She didn't put it back in the basket. She tucked it into the waistband of her shift, where the cold steel felt like a small, sharp promise against her ribs. By the second week, the snow came in earnest. It didn't fall in soft flakes. It was driven by a north wind that turned the mountain into a wall of white needles. The courtyard of Winterbourne was cleared twice a day by men using broad wooden shovels, their bare arms red from the cold, their breath rising like steam from a boiling kettle. Maeve spent her afternoons in the long gallery that overlooked the western approach. From there she could see the men training. They didn't use shields. They fought with heavy timber staves 2 at a time, circling each other in the snow until one managed to trip or throw the other into the granite wall. There was no shouting, no cheers from the onlookers. When a man went down, he got up, spat blood into the snow, and took his place again. Osmond was always there. He didn't use a staff. He fought with his bare hands against 2 or 3 at once. Maeve watched him from behind the grey glass of the gallery window. He moved with a heavy, terrifying economy. A short step to the left to let a staff whistle past his ear, a sudden flat-handed strike to a man's ribs that made him gasp and drop to his knees, a quick low sweep of his leg that sent another sprawling into the slush. He didn't look like he was enjoying it. His face was set in the same hard grey lines she had seen when he was eating his beef. It was work, tedious, heavy work that had to be done before the dark came. One afternoon, a horseman arrived from the valley. The beast was blown, its chest covered in white lather, its ribs heaving against the girth. The rider was one of her father's neighbours, a man named Caleb, who had always owed 3 bushels of barley to everyone in Galesend. He was shivering so hard his teeth clicked like castanets as he was led into the hall. Osmond didn't sit behind his table this time. He stood by the hearth, his hands behind his back, his wolfskin cloak thrown over one shoulder. Maeve stood in the shadows by the screen passage, her parsnip knife tucked into her belt. "The bailiff's dead." Caleb sputtered, his hands twitching toward the fire. "The king's men from the south. They came 3 days ago. They said the winter tax was short. They took Garrick's new ox. They took the grain from the mill." Osmond didn't move. "The south has no business in Galesend. The valley pays its tithe to the keep. They had iron coats, sire." Caleb said, his voice rising to a thin whine. 30 of them. They're staying in the church house. They say you're nothing but a dog in a stone kennel. They say they're coming for the girl next to take back the silver your bailiff paid for her." Maeve felt a cold finger touch the back of her neck. She looked at Osmond. The king's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to go darker, the grey turning to the colour of wet slate. He turned his head slightly toward Bram, who was standing by the door. 30. Osmond asked. 30, the small man says. Bram replied. How many horses? 10 with iron on their chests. The rest are pack mules and footmen. Osmond walked over to the table and picked up his iron band from the wood, slipping it over his hair with a single smooth movement. Get the horses. 6 will be enough. Caleb blinked, his mouth hanging open. 6, my lord, they have 30 swords. They have longbows from the high country. Osmond stopped beside the valley man. He was a head taller, his chest twice as broad. He didn't look angry. He looked bored the way a man looks when he has to fix a roof during a drizzle. A sword is only as good as the arm that holds it. Osmond said, and an arm is only as good as the meat inside. Go back to your ditch, Caleb. Tell your neighbours to stay inside their walls. If a man from the south comes to your door, don't scream. Just look at the mountain. He turned, and his eyes found Maeve in the dark of the passage. He didn't say anything to her, but he reached into his tunic and pulled out a small leather pouch, tossing it so that it landed with a heavy thunk at her feet. For the old man, he said. If he's still alive when the snow clears, tell him it's for the ox. Before she could pick it up, he was gone, his heavy cloak snapping behind him like a sail in a gale. The keep was quiet while the king was gone. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of a house where the master had left the hounds inside. The remaining men, the old ones whose joints had failed them, and the young ones whose coats hadn't yet grown thick, sat by the fires, sharpening their knives with long, rhythmic strokes of oil stones. Maeve didn't stay in her room. She worked in the kitchen until her hands were red and raw from the turnip water. Then she went to the gatehouse to watch the road. The snow stopped on the 3rd day. The wind died with it, leaving the mountains so silent that she could hear the ice cracking on the upper falls 3 miles away. They came back at noon. There were only 6 of them, just as they had left, but they weren't riding the same way. 2 of the horses were led by their bridles, their saddles empty, their stirrups tied up to keep them from clattering against the stones. Osmond rode at the front. His wolfskin cloak was gone, replaced by a grey wool blanket that was stained a dark, greasy brown across the chest. His face was white, not the white of fear, but the greyish white of a man who had lost more than his share of blood. Bram was behind him, his broken nose swollen to twice its size, his jaw tied up with a bloody rag. The horses walked into the courtyard, their hooves sinking deep into the fresh snow. No one shouted. No one came out to ask if they had won. Osmond slid from his horse. He didn't use the rider's hand this time. He dropped straight into the snow, his knees buckling slightly, before he caught himself against the horse's flank. He stood there for a long moment, his forehead pressed against the animal's cold leather saddle, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Maeve walked down the gatehouse stairs. Her stiff leg clicked with every step, but the sound was lost in the soft crunch of the snow. She stopped 5 paces from him. The smell of copper was so strong it made her throat close. It wasn't the smell of deer blood. It was different, thicker, sweeter, and old. Osmond raised his head. His grey eyes were bloodshot, the whites of them yellowed at the corners from exhaustion. He looked at her for a long time, as if he didn't remember who she was or why she was standing in his yard. "Your father's house is still standing," he said. His voice was nothing but a dry whisper, like dead leaves scraping across stone. "The brother. He hid under the hay wain. He's alive. And the men from the south?" Maeve asked. Osmond looked down at his hands. They were covered in dark, half-frozen crusts that had filled the lines of his palms and the rims of his nails. "They won't come back before the thaw. The crows have 3 weeks of meat down by the church house." He moved past her, his shoulder brushing hers as he went. He didn't go to the great hall. He walked toward the lower cellars where the stone was coldest, his boots leaving a trail of dark, greyish-red spots in the clean white snow. Bram stopped his horse beside her. He looked down through his swollen eyes, his breath smelling of sour beer and iron. "He took 3 of them alone," Bram said, his voice muffled by the rag around his jaw. "In the churchyard. They had him against the wall with the long spears. He didn't even use his blade. He just took them." "He's hurt," Maeve said. "He'll heal." Bram grunted, turning the horse toward the stables. "Or he won't. That's the law of the High Ridge. If the king goes soft, the mountain eats him." That night, Maeve didn't go to her pallet. She took the small jar of tallow salve and a clean piece of linen from the kitchen and walked down the dark stairs to the cellar. The air below was freezing, smelling of turnips and wet granite. There were no torches here, only the grey light of the moon coming through a grated cellar hole near the ceiling. Osmond was sitting on a pile of empty grain sacks in the corner. He had stripped off his tunic. His bare torso was a mass of dark hair, heavy muscle, and deep red gasps where the Southmen spears had found his ribs. The wounds weren't bleeding anymore, but they were open their edges grey and angry in the moonlight. He didn't move when she came in. His eyes were closed, his head leaning back against the rough stone wall. Maeve knelt beside him. The stone bit into her knees, but she didn't care. She opened the jar of tallow, the smell of sheep fat filling the narrow space between them. "Go away," he said without opening his eyes. "The old woman's hands are too crooked tonight," Maeve said, dipping 2 fingers into the cold grease. "She told me to come." "She lied," Osmond said. "She knows better than to touch me when the blood's still hot." Maeve didn't answer. She reached out and pressed her greasy fingers against the longest tear in his side. The king's whole body jerked. A low, guttural growl came from deep within his chest, a sound that wasn't human, a vibration that made the stone floor beneath her knees seem to tremble. His hand shot out, his thick fingers locking around her wrist with enough force to make her bones groan. She didn't pull back. She didn't scream. She just looked at his grey eyes, which had opened now, full of a strange, wild light that looked like foxfire in the dark. I've seen my father beat a dog until its ribs were white. She said softly, "You're not a dog, my lord, and I'm not afraid of the teeth." Osmond looked at her wrist in his grip. He saw the white skin where his fingers were squeezing the small blue veins thumping against his palm. Slowly, one by one, his fingers uncoiled. He let his hand fall back onto the grain sacks. "You're an idiot," he muttered, closing his eyes again. "A small, limping idiot." "Probably," Maeve said. She dipped her fingers into the jar again and went back to work her hands steady against his hot, torn skin. By midwinter, the world outside Winterbourne ceased to exist. The snow reached the sills of the lower windows, turning the great hall into a dark stone cave, where the only light came from the orange hearths. The men didn't train in the courtyard anymore. They sat along the benches mending harness leather and grease-polishing their boots, their conversation limited to brief, grunted words that Maeve couldn't always understand. She had learned their names now. There was Corin, who had lost his left ear to a bear when he was 12, and Thomas the cook, who had once been the king's shield-bearer before his arm was taken, and young Luke, who was only 16 and spent his nights crying into his wolfskin because his feet were black with the frost gall. She didn't pity them. In the valley, men who couldn't work were left by the road to die when the meal bags went empty. Here at least everyone got their share of the grey bread and the salt beef, even the old ones who could do nothing but sit and spit into the ash. Osmond's wounds healed with a strange, unnatural speed. Within 2 weeks, the grey edges of the spear gasps had turned to thick pink ridges that looked like old rope against his dark skin. He didn't thank her. He didn't speak to her at all during the day, but every morning when she went down to the kitchen, she found a small pile of dry pine kindling already laid by her stool and a piece of the fat back meat from the pork barrel set aside on a clean trench. One evening when the wind was loud enough to shake the heavy iron brackets on the walls, Osmond called her to his table. The hall was mostly empty. The men had gone to their quarters in the lower blockhouse to sleep off a cask of sour berry wine Thomas had opened. "Your leg," the king said, pointing his knife at her knee. "It's different when the rain comes." Maeve sat on the bench across from him. "It feels like an iron nail is driven into the bone. It goes away when the sun stays up." Osmond reached into his belt and pulled out a small, flat piece of dark wood walnut by the grain of it that had been carved into the shape of a fat, flat-headed fish. It wasn't smooth. It had rows of small notches along its back that looked like they had been put in with a small awl. "Rub it," he said, tossing it onto the table. "When the nail comes, the old people in the hills, they use the walnut to draw out the frost." Maeve picked it up. The wood was dry, smelling of old resin and oil. "Did you carve this?" "No," Osmond said, reaching for his mug. "My mother did, before the southern priests put her in the ditch." It was the first time he had mentioned a mother. Maeve looked at the iron band around his head. "Was she like you?" "She was bigger," Osmond said, a small, grim smile touching the corner of his scarred lip. "She could carry an ox-quarter 3 miles without her breath shortening. When the lords from the valley came to take the timber tithe, she didn't talk to them with silver. She threw their horses into the river. Why did they kill her? Because they were afraid," the king said. He set his mug down with a hard clack. "Men from the south, they like everything in a small box. They like the field square, the laws written on skin, and the women quiet. When they see something that doesn't fit the box, they get their iron coats and their long bows, and they don't stop until it's under the dirt." He looked at her hands, which were still stained grey from the turnip water. "Your father," he said. "He was a southern man, from the low valleys." "He was from the salt marshes," Maeve said. "He came north because he killed a man for a sheepskin." "He's a coward," Osmond said simply. "But he had one good thought." "What was that?" "He didn't try to keep you," the king said, standing up and throwing his cloak over his broad shoulders. "If you'd stayed in that valley, you'd be dead before the next harvest. The miller would have had you in his ditch by Christ's mass. He walked toward the door, his silent stride taking him into the dark of the gallery, before she could think of an answer. Maeve stayed by the fire, her fingers tracing the small notches on the walnut fish, until the log turned to grey ash, and the cold came back through the floor. The thaw came in March, not with sunshine, but with a week of warm yellow rain that turned the mountain snow into a roaring torrent of mud and slate. The road to the valley reopened as a grey ditch filled with loose stone. The first thing to come up the path was an old mule, its ribs like barrel staves carrying a man whose legs were tied under its belly with a piece of old rope. It was Alden. Her brother didn't look like the boy who had greased the boots in the cottage. His face was the colour of curdled milk, his right arm bound to his chest with a filthy piece of sailcloth that was black with old rot at the elbow. They brought him into the hall, where he fell off the mule like a sack of turnips, his good hand clutching at the cold stone floor. Maeve didn't run to him. She stood by the kitchen door, her horn-handled knife in her waistband, her arms crossed over her apron. "Maeve." Alden gasped, his teeth clicking together so hard a line of red foam appeared on his lip. "The old man. He's gone. The Southmen came back. Not the soldiers. The great lord's bailiff. With the red coats." Osmond came down from the gallery, his iron band glinting in the grey light from the high windows. He didn't look at Alden. He looked at Bram, who was standing by the door with his spear. "Who let this meat into my yard?" the king asked. "He's her brother's sire," Bram said. "The gatekeeper found him by the lower fold. The mule was about to go over the cliff." Alden raised his head, his yellow eyes wide with a terror that looked like madness. "They're burning the valley, my lord. Every house from here to the ford. They say you took the king's silver and kept the girl anyway. They say they're going to hang every man who paid tithe to the keep." He looked at Maeve, his hand reaching out across the grease-stained stone. "You have to tell him, Maeve. Tell him to give you back. The great lord, he has 300 swords at the ford. He has the iron wagons." Maeve looked down at her brother. She remembered how he used to take her share of the small fish they caught in the creek, because he was the boy. She remembered how he had stood by the door while her father counted the 5-piece piles. "The silver was for the ox, Alden," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the shaking that usually came with her village memories. "The king didn't steal anything. They don't care about the ox." Alden screamed, his voice cracking into a high, childish whine. "They want the mountain. They say the wolves are a pestilence. They have the great hounds from the south, the ones with the wide jaws that can snap a man's leg like a carrot." Osmond walked over and stood over the boy. He looked like an oak tree next to a broken briar. He reached down with one foot and turned Alden over onto his back, his boot heel resting lightly against the boy's rotting arm. Alden shrieked, his eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. 300, Osmond asked. 300 or more. Alden whimpered. "The redcoats. They have the fireboxes too. The ones that shoot the lead balls." Osmond looked at Maeve. "Your brother is a poor creature." "He's the only one left," she said. "He won't last the night anyway," the king said, pointing his boot toward the red stain on the sailcloth. "The bone rot's already in his shoulder. Thomas!" The cook came out of the kitchen, his single hand holding a heavy iron cleaver. "Take him to the tool house," Osmond said. "Take the arm off at the joint. If he lives, he can clean the stables. If he dies, give him to the crows." "No!" Alden screamed as Thomas dragged him away by his heels, his head bumping against the stone steps with a dull, hollow sound. "Maeve, tell him you're my sister." Maeve didn't look at him as the door closed. She looked at Osmond, whose grey eyes were fixed on the narrow windows that faced south. "They're coming for the stone, aren't they?" she asked. "They're coming for everything," the king said. "They've been wanting this ridge since my grandfather's time. They just needed a name to put on the skin. Your name is as good as any." He reached out and touched her hair, not with the rough grip of her chin, but with a slow, heavy stroke that felt like the wind before a storm. His hand was so hot her skin tingled under his fingers. "Are you afraid, Maeve? I was afraid when I came here," she said, looking up into his grey sky of a face. "Now I'm just cold." "Good," the king said. "The cold is our friend. It makes the iron brittle. It makes the southern horses slip on the rocks. We'll go down to meet them tomorrow." The valley didn't look like Galesend anymore. The grey mist was gone, replaced by a thick yellow smoke that smelled of burning thatch and old hay. The small cottages along the lane were nothing but black stone shells, their chimneys standing like old teeth against the rainy sky. Osmond's pack didn't look like an army. There were 40 of them, all told the old men, the young boys, and the 30 who had survived the winter in the high blockhouses. They didn't wear iron coats. They wore their greasy leather tunics and carried their long hunting spears, their movements silent as they slipped through the scrub oak by the river. Maeve rode behind Bram on the great black horse. Osmond had refused to leave her at the keep. If we lose the ford, he had said, the old woman won't have the strength to throw you off the wall before they get to the gates. They found the southern army at the old stone bridge where the river ran wide and shallow over the grey pebbles. The redcoats were there, their iron armour bright, even in the drizzle, their silk banners blue and gold dripping wet against their long ashwood spears. They had 3 wagons with large iron-hooped barrels on them, and a line of horses that were twice the size of the mountain beasts, their chests covered in boiled leather plate. The great lord's captain was a man with a golden beard and an iron helmet that had an eagle's wing carved into the crest. He stood on the bridge, his sword drawn, his voice ringing out across the water like a church bell. "Osmond of the Ridge," the captain shouted, "by order of the High Council, you are a masterless beast. Give up the girl and the silver, and you may take your dogs back to the stones until the court decides your tithe." Osmond didn't answer from the bushes. He didn't have a sword. He stood by the water's edge, his shaggy hair wet against his forehead, his grey eyes fixed on the horses on the bridge. "Bram," the king muttered. "Sire," the rider said, his hand tightening on his spear. "The wagons first. The fireboxes don't like the wet, but if they get them dry under the cloths, they'll break the horses." Then the king did something Maeve had never seen. He didn't roar. He didn't drop his skin. He simply knelt in the grey mud by the river, his hands flat against the earth, and gave a long, low whistle, a sound that wasn't a bird or a dog, but a high, vibrating note that seemed to come from the mountain itself. From the dark of the pine forest behind them, the real pack came. They weren't men. They weren't even the large wolves of the winter stories. They were huge, gaunt things, their coats the colour of wet slate, their eyes the same yellow-brown as Bram's. There were 40 or 50 of them moving through the scrub oak without a sound, their ribs showing through their skin, their long jaws open and dripping with grey saliva. The southern horses smelled them first. A great black charger screamed its front legs, striking the air as it tried to turn on the narrow stone bridge. Another slipped on the wet granite, its rider going down under its flank with a loud metallic clank that sounded like a dropped kettle. "Fire!" the captain shouted, his golden beard shaking. "In the name of the king, fire!" One of the iron-hooped barrels gave a loud, terrifying boom that filled the valley with a thick white smoke that smelled of sulphur. A line of lead balls tore through the scrub oak, shredding the leaves and snapping the branches, but the wolves weren't there anymore. They were already in the water. Maeve watched from the saddle as Osmond led them. He didn't turn into a beast. He remained a man, but he moved with a speed that no human muscles could manage. He crossed the shallow river in 3 great bounds, his bare hands catching the first southern soldier by the throat before the man could draw his dagger. The iron coat didn't save him. Osmond's fingers didn't just grip, they tore the iron plates buckling under his hands like old tin, the red blood spurting out into the grey water with a soft hissing sound. The battle didn't last an hour. The southern soldiers had the numbers, but they had no room on the narrow bridge. The wagons became a trap, blocking their retreat, while the wolves came from the flanks, their long jaws snapping at the horses' hocks and the men's unarmoured thighs. The captain with the golden beard tried to reach Osmond. He was a brave man, his long sword whistling through the rain in a series of bright silver arcs that left 2 of the mountain boys dead in the mud. Osmond met him on the centre arch of the bridge. The captain drove his sword straight at the king's chest. Osmond didn't dodge. He caught the blade between his bare palms, the steel groaning as his hot skin met the cold iron. With a single twisting motion of his shoulders, he snapped the sword in 2, the tip of it falling into the river below with a tiny plop. The captain froze, his blue eyes wide behind his eagle-winged helmet. Osmond didn't use a knife. He took the man by the ears and drove his forehead into the captain's face once, twice, 3 times, until the iron helmet was crushed into the bone beneath. The redcoats broke then. They dropped their spears and ran into the marsh grass, their iron boots sucking in the mud, while the gaunt, slate-coloured wolves followed them into the dark, like sheepdogs after a stray flock. Osmond stayed on the bridge. He was covered from head to foot in the sweet copper blood of the lowlands, his breath coming in long, shuddering wheezes that shook his massive chest. He turned his head and looked up the lane toward the place where Bram's horse stood. His eyes weren't grey anymore. They were black entirely. Black, the pupils having swallowed the iris until he looked like a thing that had never known the sound of a human word. Maeve slid down from the saddle. Her leg gave its familiar click, but she didn't stumble. She walked across the slippery stone of the bridge, her thin hide shoes stepping over the broken spears and the red puddles until she stood 3 paces from him. The wolves were circling the bridge now, their yellow eyes fixed on her, their nostrils working as they caught her scent. They didn't growl. They looked at the king, waiting for the word to take the small, limping girl. Maeve reached into her apron and pulled out the small walnut fish. She held it out to him on her open palm. "The nail's back, my lord," she said, her voice steady in the yellow rain. "The frost is coming down from the ridge again." Osmond looked at the carved wood. The blackness in his eyes didn't go away instantly, but his shoulders dropped an inch. He reached out with a hand that was twice the size of hers, his fingers dripping with the captain's blood, and took the small fish from her skin. He didn't speak. He turned and walked back towards the mountain, his silent, heavy stride leading the pack away from the burning valley, leaving the dead to the crows and the silver to the mud. They returned to Winterbourne when the moon was high and thin. The keep was the same as it had been when she left, grey, silent and smelling of old sheepskins. But the valley below was dead. There would be no grain from Galesend this year. There would be no cattle brought up from the bailiff's folds. They carried the wounded into the great hall. Young Luke was dead, his throat torn out by a southern dagger, and Corin had a lead ball in his thigh that Thomas had to cut out with the kitchen knife, while 3 men held the boy down on the trestle table. Maeve sat by the small hearth in her western blockhouse. She had washed her shift, but the smell of the copper blood seemed to have soaked into the wool of her shawl, staying in her nose, no matter how much she breathed the lime wash. The door opened without a sound. Osmond came in. He had washed his hands, but the pink scars on his ribs were still raw and red from the strain of the bridge. He wasn't wearing his iron band. His dark, shaggy hair fell over his eyes like a curtain. He sat on the floor by her hearth, his long legs stretched out toward the kindling she had laid. "Your brother died," he said. Maeve didn't look up from her mother's comb. The rot was too deep," the king said. "Thomas took it off, but the boy's heart stopped before we could get the iron to the stump. We put him in the ditch by the wall. He was always a poor creature." Maeve said softly. He didn't like the cold. Osmond reached out and took her foot, the bad one, and pulled it onto his knee. He began to unwrap the grey flannel strips with his thick, scarred fingers, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man who had broken an eagle-winged helmet with his forehead. Her ankle was blue, swollen from the long ride and the wet mud of the ford. "They'll come back in the autumn," Osmond said, his grey eyes fixed on her red skin. "The great lord, he has more than 300. He has the king's own guard from the city. They'll bring the big fireboxes next time, the ones that can shake the granite blocks." "Will you run?" she asked. "Where would we go?" The king said, dipping his fingers into the jar of tallow salve he had brought with him. "The mountain is all we have. If we leave the stone, we're nothing but dogs in the brush. They'll hunt us down with the longbows before we reach the sea." He smeared the grease over her joint, his hot skin sending a sudden sharp wave of relief through her stiff bone. "They'll kill you because of me," Maeve said. Osmond stopped his rubbing. He looked up at her face, his muddy grey eyes wide and flat in the torchlight. "They're killing us because we're here, Maeve. You were just the name on the skin. If it hadn't been you, it would have been the timber tithe or the sheep tax. They don't need a reason to tear down a fence. They just need to see that the man inside is different." He stood up, his great head nearly touching the lime-washed rafters. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a piece of the mountain that had been hacked off and given a heart. "You can go if you want," he said, pointing toward the arrow slit. "The road to the south is clear now. The redcoats are gone from the church house. You can take the mule and the pouch of silver I gave you. You can find a man in the low valleys who has a square field and a square house and a box for everything." Maeve looked at the hearth, at the small birch logs that were turning to clean white ash. She thought of her father's greasy fingers counting the 5-piece piles. She thought of the miller's 3 wives in the churchyard and the smell of the turnip beer behind the flour barrel. Then she looked at Osmond's side, where the pink scars of the Southmen spears were still puckered and angry. She stood up her knee, giving its little click, and walked over to him. She didn't take his chin. She simply pressed her hand against his broad chest, right over the spot where his heart was thumping with that slow, heavy, non-human rhythm. His skin was hot enough to burn, but she didn't pull back. "The low valleys are full of mud," she said, "and the boxes are too small for a girl with a slow leg." Osmond didn't speak. He reached out his great wolf-scarred arms and pulled her against his chest, his chin resting on her shaggy hair, his wolf-skin cloak closing around her like a wall of dark stone. Outside, the north wind came back down from the high ridge, blowing the rain away and bringing the frost back to the pines. It whistled through the arrow slit, a long, low moan that sounded like someone blowing across the top of an empty jug. But inside the blockhouse the fire was laid. The walls were thick and the teeth were all on her side. If Maeve's dark journey into the winter ridges held your heart until the final word, don't let her story end in the shadows. Hit that like button to show your support for raw, grounded storytelling, and share this video with those who appreciate a romance born of iron and survival rather than fairy tales. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming dark historical chronicles. Leave a comment below, letting us know your favourite part of Maeve and Osmond's story. Your engagement keeps the fires burning in the keep. Let's see you in the next chronicle.